Hey, welcome to number 27 and to the Ferrari Testarossa, a car that looks like a stallion but handles like a hippo. In this video, I'm going to tell you why it has that reputation. We're going to find out if it's justified, and I'm going to tell you about the incredible flaw that Ferrari intentionally engineered into the Testarossa. But first of all, it's important to say that this was not a commercial flop. Indeed, in 12 years, this sold 5 times more than the Countach did in 16 years. But it has long had a reputation as a car that is not actually very good to drive. That is because of a real mismatch in expectations about what this car actually is and what people expect it to be. And then secondly, it does in reality have a big flaw. Before we talk about either of those things, let's just hop back and I'm going to tell you about some of the interesting details that surround the Testarossa. Okay, so firstly, why on earth was it so wide? Now, by modern standards, it's actually not that bad, but certainly in the 1980s, seeing one of these, it was pretty impressive. And there is a reason for that. This car is 6 inches wider than the one it was based on, the 512BB. One of the main complaints about the 512 was that it toasted you in the cabin. That's because it had the radiators up front. That meant that there was piping coming all the way along the bottom of the car through the cabin, which would heat you up. The other thing they complained about was there wasn't enough room for luggage, considering it was supposed to be a GT. So Ferrari cleverly decided to move the radiators from the front to the back. That helped with both issues. You didn't have the pipe work going on, so the cabin doesn't get as hot, and they created room up front for luggage. This has a decent boot at the front of the car. As a consequence though, you have these massive sort of side pods here, the radiators behind them, and these side strakes that are such an iconic part of the car are actually only there because of US safety regulations. It would otherwise have a big hole there, and in the US they couldn't do that because they're worried about pedestrian safety. So one of the most distinctive parts of the Testarossa is there by accident. Now, the interior has a couple of quirks, but before that, let me just say that incredibly for an Italian car of this era, it's actually pretty comfortable. The wheel is more or less where you'd expect it to be. It's a good reach. The legs a little bit scrunched up, but not too bad. Plenty of room in here. And I'm starting to think, wow, the driving position is actually great, till you realise that your feet are very much offset to the left. I guess in a car from Italy of this era, it couldn't be perfect. But the other couple of things which are quite interesting about this is that the lights, the fog lights, are up in the roof along with I think that's a little light, a movable light, like a map reading light. And then you've got your sort of 80s, a series of 80s buttons. The thing about this interior and the instrumentation is it just screams 80s, really like the rest of the car. Also, it has that incredible mirror on the passenger side bin, which I really don't know what Ferrari were thinking. And quite neatly, they've sort of hidden the radio behind this little flip panel here. So this model, I think, is the first mild facelift of the Testarossa. So it still has the monoblock or mono nut wheels, monodados, I think they're called, but it has the 2 wing mirrors. So the engine puts out 385 horsepower. Later versions had about 40 to 50 horsepower more. See if it's really as bad to drive as people say, and of course talk about that incredible flaw. Now, first of all, the gearbox is absolutely incredibly notchy, and I mean it sort of takes it onto another level. I've driven a lot of Ferraris, but this gearbox is possibly the most difficult to operate I've come across. It's still nice, but you have to be quite forceful, and especially going from first to second. Richard says that there's a possibility that it might be slightly misaligned, the gearbox mechanism, and it certainly feels like it could be. Do go and have a look at Richard's Instagram. He's got a nice little collection of cars, and if you want to ask him any more questions about this, Instagram is probably the best way. You can reach him here. Aside from the gearbox, I mean, the ride is absolutely amazing. It's really, really good. This is a very wide car, and it seems to be able to have that trick as a result. It doesn't really lean that much in corners, and yet it rides incredibly well over anything but the biggest bumps. It's also really pretty comfortable, as I've said, in terms of the interior. It's not too noisy. Thankfully, this one does have a sports exhaust on it, and it is an absolute requirement on Testarossas because as standard, they just are way too quiet. They don't even sound like a 12-cylinder car. On this one, I think it's just got the right balance between enough noise and too much. So that is great. The steering is incredibly sweet. It's absolutely lovely, a little bit heavy at parking speeds, but once you're going, it's got that lovely tactile feel. It's quite light, so much feedback. It is one of the car's highlights, I would say. Sounds amazing. Tight corners it doesn't like, and more generally speaking, it feels again a bit like my 308. It's one of those Ferraris that seems to like the sort of slight quicker bends, definitely doesn't like sharper, slower turns. There's also something else. You're always aware when you're driving it, it feels like there's quite a lot of weight in the back, and weight distribution is 60 to the back, 40 to the front, so it really shouldn't feel like that. That kind of brings me on to what I was talking about with regards to mismatches in expectation, as well as like some very real flaws that the Testarossa does have. But before that, let's just take it through the gears. Yeah, so I mean, driven at slower sort of speeds, it's not too bad. As soon as you start driving it harder, it moves around and you can really feel some weight in the back. Now, when I was saying that people were disappointed by how this drives, especially contemporary road testers, I can understand why. It simply doesn't drive as a sports car. But this is where that mismatch in expectations comes in. Because of the way this car looks, because it was mid-engined, everybody expected it to drive like a sports car, was therefore disappointed and said that it drove like a bit of heat. That's because if you take it on a road like this and try and drive it properly hard, it just doesn't like it and it doesn't really seem to work. That's the point. That is not the Testarossa's role. The Testarossa was always supposed to be a GT. And as a GT, it works extremely well. So that partly explains why in some circles it has that reputation that it wasn't a good car. It's not true. Designed for what it was as a GT is an excellent car. If you think it's going to be a chuckable scalpel-like sports car, then it's just not going to do that. Part of the reason why it cannot do that is the crazy decision that Ferrari made to change their GTs from front-engined to mid-engined. In order to do that, the packaging required that they put the gearbox under the engine. A lot of people think these 12s are boxer engines. They're not. This is a 120-degree version of the original V12 that was in the Daytona. But really, mid-engine GTs, as we've seen, don't work. The trade-off with having the engine with the gearbox underneath, as this has, is that the engine is way too high. And I've driven a few of these now, and it always surprises me just how obviously you can feel that. You can feel that the weight is high up. So it's never going to handle like an Elise or a proper mid-engine sports car. Then again, it was never supposed to do that. And one of the positives about this is that because weight distribution is 60-40, but because there is so much weight in one particular point with the engine and gearbox directly above each other, it has an incredibly low polar center of inertia. So that is why I think it's got such a sweet steer, at least in the sort of the longer turns, not the really tight ones, but where the weight starts to get into play. But just when you're changing direction, it just feels absolutely lovely. Thank you all so much for watching, and if you're interested, have a look at the other car that Richard also has that he brought me, the M635i. I'll put that video there. If there's a car that you own that you want me to do a review on, then please do get in touch, either my Instagram or my email. Thank you so much, and I really look forward to seeing you for the next video.